Hey there, history buffs and curious minds! Welcome back to the channel where we dive deep into the stories that shaped our world. Today, we're tackling one of the most pivotal moments in religious history, the Protestant Reformation. Picture this, it's the early 16th century, and the Catholic Church is the undisputed powerhouse of Europe. But beneath the surface, cracks are starting to show. Corruption, greed, and a growing disconnect between the Church and its followers are brewing a storm. Enter Martin Luther, a German monk who, in 1517, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg. This single act didn't just spark a debate. It ignited a religious revolution that would forever change Christianity. But what exactly led to this seismic shift? How did one man's protest lead to the birth of Protestantism? And what were the long-term consequences for Europe and the world? Buckle up, because we're about to unravel the story of the Protestant Reformation. A turning point that reshaped not just religion, but politics, culture, and society as we know it. Before we dive into the Reformation itself, let's set the stage. In the early 16th century, the Catholic Church was the dominant force in Europe. It wasn't just a religious institution. It was a political, economic, and cultural powerhouse. The Pope had influence over kings, and the Church controlled vast amounts of land and wealth. But with great power comes great corruption. One of the biggest issues was the sale of indulgences. Essentially, the Church was selling get-out-of-purgatory-free cards. The idea was that by donating money to the Church, you could reduce the amount of time your loved ones, or even yourself, would spend in purgatory. Sounds sketchy, right? Well, it was. This practice was widely criticized, and many saw it as a blatant cash grab. But it wasn't just indulgences. The Church was also plagued by nepotism, with clergy positions often being handed out to family members rather than qualified individuals. And let's not forget the lavish lifestyles of some church leaders, which stood in stark contrast to the poverty of many of their followers. All of this created a growing sense of discontent. People were starting to question the Church's authority and practices. The stage was set for a rebellion, and it would come from an unlikely source, a humble monk named Martin Luther. Now, let's talk about the man of the hour, Martin Luther. Born in 1483 in Eisleben, Germany, Luther was a devout Catholic who initially had no intention of challenging the Church. In fact, he became a monk after a near-death experience, vowing to dedicate his life to God. But as Luther studied the Bible, he began to question some of the Church's teachings. One of his biggest issues was the idea of salvation. The Catholic Church taught that salvation could be earned through good deeds and the sacraments. But Luther believed that salvation was a gift from God, granted through faith alone. This idea, known as justification by faith, would become a cornerstone of Protestant theology. In 1517, Luther decided to take a stand. He wrote his 95 Theses, a list of arguments against the sale of indulgences and other church practices, and nailed them to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. This wasn't just a random act of rebellion, it was a call for debate. But what Luther didn't expect was how quickly his ideas would spread. Thanks to the recent invention of the printing press, copies of the 95 Theses were distributed across Europe like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone was talking about Luther's criticisms of the Church. The Pope wasn't too happy about this, and Luther was eventually excommunicated in 1521. But by then it was too late. The Reformation had begun, and there was no turning back. With Luther's ideas spreading like wildfire, it wasn't long before others began to challenge the Catholic Church. One of the most notable figures was John Calvin, a French theologian who took Luther's ideas and expanded on them. Calvin's teachings, which emphasized predestination, the idea that God has already decided who will be saved, would become the foundation of Calvinism, a major branch of Protestantism. But it wasn't just theologians who were getting involved. The Reformation also had major political implications. Many European rulers saw it as an opportunity to break away from the Church's authority and assert their own power. For example, in England, King Henry VIII famously broke with the Catholic Church after the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. This led to the establishment of the Church of England, with the king as its head. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Reformation led to widespread conflict. The Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 was, in part, a result of the social upheaval caused by the Reformation. Peasants, inspired by Luther's ideas of equality, rose up against their feudal lords. However, Luther himself didn't support the rebellion, and it was brutally suppressed. By the mid-16th century, Protestantism had taken root across much of Northern Europe. But the Catholic Church wasn't going down without a fight. As Protestantism continued to spread, the Catholic Church launched its own response, the Counter-Reformation. This was a period of internal reform and renewal aimed at addressing some of the issues that had led to the Reformation in the first place. One of the key events of the Counter-Reformation was the Council of Trent, which met between 1545 and 1563. The council reaffirmed Catholic doctrine, rejected Protestant teachings, and introduced a series of reforms aimed at cleaning up corruption within the Church. Another important aspect of the Counter-Reformation was the rise of new religious orders, such as the Jesuits. Founded by Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuits played a key role in spreading Catholicism around the world, particularly in the Americas and Asia. But the Counter-Reformation wasn't just about reform, it was also about suppression. The Inquisition was used to root out heresy, and Protestants were often persecuted in Catholic countries. Despite these efforts, Protestantism continued to grow. By the end of the 16th century, Europe was deeply divided along religious lines, a division that would lead to centuries of conflict. The Protestant Reformation didn't just change the religious landscape of Europe, it had far-reaching effects on politics, culture, and society. One of the most significant impacts was the rise of individualism. Luther's emphasis on personal faith and the authority of the Bible encouraged people to think for themselves, rather than relying on the Church for guidance. This shift in thinking would eventually pave the way for the Enlightenment and the rise of modern democracy. The Reformation also had a major impact on education. Protestants believed that everyone should be able to read the Bible for themselves, which led to an emphasis on literacy and the establishment of schools. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Reformation is the diversity of Christian denominations we see today. From Lutherans and Calvinists to Baptists and Methodists, the Reformation gave birth to a wide range of Protestant traditions, each with its own beliefs and practices. So, there you have it, the story of the Protestant Reformation, a movement that began with one monk's protest and ended up reshaping the world. It's a story of courage, conflict, and change, and it's a reminder of the power of ideas to transform society. The Reformation wasn't just a religious event, it was a cultural and political earthquake that continues to influence us today. Whether you're a believer or not, there's no denying the impact it had on the course of history. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of the most pivotal moments in religious history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your fellow history enthusiasts. And if you're new here, consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. From ancient myths to modern movements, we've got plenty of fascinating content coming your way. Subscribe now for more epic stories from history and mythology. Click the bell so you never miss a video.